Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has spoken to Donald Trump this afternoon about how to respond after the suspected chemical attack in Syria. It's thought the UK, the US and France are considering a joint military response. Syria is being blamed. Chemical weapons inspectors are to go to the affected area in Syria to investigate. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
Outside Damascus, the war goes on. This was the aftermath of a conventional attack in Idlib, the rebel-held province to which many fighters and families from eastern Ghouta have been transferred. Only a small fraction of the 500,000 dead in Syria's war have been killed by chemical weapons. More displaced people are being bussed out of Douma, the town that the West and others say was hit by chemical weapons. A trusted BBC source, Abdallah Abu Haman, saw the immediate aftermath of the attack.
We entered the building and all the dead bodies were still there. The ambulances couldn't reach the bodies due to the shelling. The bodies had signs of suffocation. The skin was blue and there was foaming at the mouth and the eyes were popped out.
In Moscow, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, demanded a transparent and honest investigation and warned against groundless accusations by enemies of Syria and Russia. He means the US, Britain and France, who've slammed Moscow and Damascus at the UN Security Council in New York. The three Western powers are discussing military options, most likely whether or not to bomb.
Well, first of all, this attack that took place in Douma is a barbaric attack. Obviously, we are working urgently with our allies and partners to assess what has happened on the ground. If this is the responsibility of Assad's regime in Syria, then it's yet another example of the brutality and brazen disregard for their people that they show.
There are no easy options for the Americans, the British and the French in Syria. It's become a very crowded battlefield. President Assad's men work very closely with the Russians and the Iranians. The Western powers need to avoid making matters worse. Introducing more force into such a highly militarized country increases the chances of escalating the conflict. Airstrikes are possible, like those of a year ago after another chemical attack. But more important than simple reprisals and much harder is agreeing a convincing strategy for Syria's future. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
Well, we can go now to our diplomatic correspondent James Landale, who's outside the Foreign Office for us. And James, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity this afternoon.
That's right, Rita, and that diplomacy is taking two paths. One is the debate about the international community's response and the possibility of military action. And today, the Prime Minister spoke to President Macron of France and also Donald Trump. And according to Downing Street, they agreed that, yes, the international community needed to uphold the worldwide prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. They also agreed to continue to work together to ensure that those responsible were held to account. The Prime Minister also convened her National Security Council to discuss the options. And the impression I'm getting at the moment is that the debate about all those options is still ongoing. It has yet to reach a natural conclusion. The second path through all the diplomacy is at the United Nations, where tonight there will be a row over what form of investigation should be launched into events in Douma. There are US versions and there are Russian motions doing the rounds. There will be votes and vetoes tonight. At the same time, the chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW, has unilaterally decided that it wants to try and shortly send its own fact-finding mission to Douma. And the reason this matters is because if investigators suddenly turn up on the ground, then that potentially could make military action problematic. Rita.
James, thank you. James Landale there.
Here, Theresa May has declared that the international community needed to respond to uphold the worldwide ban on chemical weapons and hold those responsible to account after she talked by phone with President Trump. And in the last few moments, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, has said France would decide within days with the UK and the United States over how to respond. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, reports, and just to warn you, there are some distressing images in his report.
This is one of the missiles which it's thought brought Saturday's suspected chemical attack on Douma, in which it's reckoned around 500 people were hurt, including at least 40 killed. These pictures today show buses filled with rebel fighters and their families arriving at a camp in northwest Syria, having left Douma since the attacks. Donald Trump met the Emir of Qatar today and spoke to Theresa May on the phone. The White House say they agreed not to allow the use of chemical weapons to continue. And she herself confirmed she wants a tough response once it's sure who's to blame.
The first stage is for us to be assessing with our partners and allies what has actually happened in Syria on the ground. Obviously what we've seen is a chemical weapons attack, an appalling chemical weapons attack. If this is the responsibility of the Assad regime, then it is another example of the brutality and brazen disregard he shows for his people. And we believe that those responsible should be held to account.
Jeremy Corbyn urged more investigation too, but then wants political action, not military action.
I think the UK should intervene by helping to bring about a political solution and supporting the United Nations in investigating the chemical weapons attack, again finding out who did it. We cannot live in a world where people use chemical weapons, whoever they are, against anybody. It's simply wrong.
5 years ago, the Commons famously blocked David Cameron joining US strikes against Syria's use of chemical weapons then. That vote, in turn, caused President Obama to back down from attacking Syria. Some Tories who voted against action 5 years ago might back it now if it doesn't get Britain embroiled in another civil war like Libya.
The great danger is that what starts out as a punishment operation will end up as a massive intervention on behalf of the opposition in the Syrian civil war, and that would be a disastrous mistake.
In 2013, with protests outside the Commons, Labour voted against military action. Some Labour MPs now think that was wrong.
Yeah, I think that was a mistake. Quite frankly, I wasn't there at the time, but I do think that was a mistake, and I do think there would be more support for action now. And one thing I'd say about my constituency, I can't speak for all Labour MPs, obviously, but my constituents have systematically, routinely called for greater action to support those people who are turned into refugees, but also to actually intervene to try and prevent civilians becoming casualties of war and innocent victims of war crimes.
With Donald Trump talking yesterday of a major decision within 48 hours, there was speculation earlier today that Britain might announce very soon that it was joining America and France in military strikes on Syria. Talk too of Parliament being recalled perhaps later this week. But tonight, the pace seems to have slowed a little, with Britain, America and France still discussing the various options and awaiting firm evidence from the international weapons inspectors who've been sent to Douma today to investigate. Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, President Trump promised a forceful response to the apparent chemical attack. So what could that mean? Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, is with me now. Lindsay, tell us what the options are for the Allies.
President Macron has just said that within the next few days, the French, the British and the Americans will make a decision. That sounds like a little bit of rowing back, or at least waiting, because none of the options are very good. There are plenty of assets, as the military call it, in the region. There are aircraft carriers, there are submarines with Tomahawk missiles, there are bases in Gulf countries. They can attack Syrian air bases with no particular difficulty. But what then? What are the consequences? Because if they go for it big, even if they warn the Russians, there are many Russian soldiers around and also Russian hardware. If they take a lot of that out, well, that's a direct confrontation with Russia. That's a real escalation. Is that what President Trump wants? There's no indication that in the past that that's what he's been looking for.
And it's all slightly puzzling because around about a week ago, Donald Trump was talking about disengaging from Syria, wasn't he? How do you explain that?
Well, that's right, because the few American troops which are there are supposed to be fighting ISIS, not Assad. But he's in a difficult situation. Almost exactly a year ago, there was a similar chemical weapons attack on civilians ascribed by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to the Syrian government. The Americans fired 59 cruise missiles at the Syrian airbase, which they said the attack had been launched from. It didn't make a lot of difference. You can't find these chemical weapons. They could be in barrels, you know, all over the place. And that was just symbolic. He's got to do something more than symbolic. But if he escalates, well, then he's back into the situation, you know, which you had with the Iraq War. And Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, the pottery barn principle, if you break it, you own it. There's no indication that the Americans, the British or the French want that. So none of their options are good.
Lindsay, thanks very much.
Authorising military action is perhaps the greatest responsibility of any British Prime Minister. Today, in a phone call with President Trump, Theresa May agreed that the international community did need to respond to the suspected illegal use of chemical weapons in Syria. The attacks on Saturday night are thought to be the work of President Assad on rebels and on his own people, children among them. But now Mrs May has to decide what part Britain will play in any international action and when. After President Trump supported her over the Salisbury spy poisoning, she's under some pressure to support him. The latest from Washington in a moment. First, though, Mrs May's dilemmas, what to do and whether to recall Parliament to sanction it.
The normal business of being Prime Minister, a meeting with the Portuguese Premier Antonio Costa. But surely at least a part of her head was elsewhere, working out a response to that heart-rending chemical attack in Douma, Syria, widely regarded as the evil handiwork of the country's president, Assad. What next?
We're working with our allies and partners to assess what has happened on the ground in Syria. It is a barbaric chemical weapons attack that has taken place, of course, illegal use of chemical weapons.
And a former PM was, well, a bit more forthright.
Frankly, if you don't take action, you've given carte blanche to the Assad regime and their backers, the Russians and the Iranians, to carry on doing this.
This afternoon, Theresa May discussed with these senior ministers on the National Security Council whether we should join military action against Assad, expected to be taken by America and France, and whether they dare sanction an attack without seeking the backing of MPs. August 2013, this was the last time Parliament was asked to vote on whether the UK should join with France and America in an airborne attack on Assad. MPs said no, partly because Labour voted against the then Prime Minister David Cameron.
It is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
And today, Labour's current leader gave a strong signal that he personally is against military action, though he gave no clue whether he would force his MPs in any vote to oppose a strike on Syria.
The intervention ought to be to support the United Nations in undertaking an investigation into the chemical weapons attack. That's what the UN has called for and other nations have called for. But also, there has to be a political solution in Syria.
But the always independently minded most senior MP says that Theresa May must take the risk of asking MPs for their assent.
Do you think Theresa May should involve Britain in an attack on Syria without recalling Parliament?
You can't go in for a military act against another state without parliamentary approval. I think she'd probably get parliamentary approval, but I think you would have to summon Parliament promptly.
So your view is that a strike on Syria with missiles would be acceptable, but not the use of British troops?
A target attack on an airfield from which chemical weapons have been used will not get you involved in that unless you're so foolish as to let Donald Trump, if that happens to be his mood next Friday, to persuade you to send troops in, which I would be absolutely against.
It was on Saturday that the worldwide ban on the use of chemical weapons was breached in Syria. that the perpetrator should be held to account was agreed today by Theresa May in phone calls with the presidents of France and America. Joint action against Assad seems close. Robert Peston, News at 10.
Well, President Trump had promised some kind of response to the suspected chemical attacks within 48 hours. With that deadline running out, it looks like the decks are being cleared for some kind of action. President Trump's cancelled a trip to South America. His defence secretary's cancelled a trip of his own. And tonight at the United Nations in New York, Russia blocked the setting up of a new investigation into suspected chemical weapons attacks in Syria, prompting anger from both the British and American ambassadors.
The president was today meeting with the Emir of Qatar, the Gulf nation that hosts a major US airbase in the Middle East. Donald Trump has now abruptly cancelled a visit to South America this week. Another signal that a military strike on Syria is imminent. The Emir backing decisive action.
We see the suffering of the Syrian people. And me and the president, we see eye to eye that this matter has to stop immediately. We cannot tolerate with a war criminal. We cannot tolerate with someone who killed more than 500,000 of his own people. And this matter should end immediately.
A military attack on Syria is immeasurably complicated by the presence of Russian forces on the ground, and from the deployment 2 years ago of the highly capable S-400 air defense system. The question is whether Moscow decides to actively defend Syrian airspace, but the Western powers will still have a range of military options. They have multiple air bases in the region, including in Iraq and Qatar. It's not clear if Turkey will allow the base at Incirlik to be used. There is also the USS Donald Cook, a guided missile destroyer in the eastern Mediterranean. The French are likely to play a role. They have access to air bases in the UAE and Jordan. Britain, if it participates at all, has an air base at RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. The problem, though, is this. Almost exactly a year ago, the US launched a punishment strike on Assad's regime, firing 59 cruise missiles. It caused considerable damage to an airfield and to the Syrian Air Force, but did not alter Assad's behavior. In fact, it only strengthened Russian and Iranian resolve to keep the Syrian leader in place. At the UN Security Council a short time ago, a US resolution to set up an investigation into this weekend's use of chemical weapons was vetoed by the Russians.
In contra. Those against.
Leading to this riposte by Britain's new ambassador to the UN.
By vetoing, Russia has crossed a line in the international order. Mr. President, Russia's credibility as a member of the Council is now in question. We will not stand idly by and watch Russia continue to undermine global norms which have ensured all our security, including Russia's, for decades.
A year ago, the Pentagon gave Moscow advance warning of the missile strike. This time it is far from clear they will do the same, greatly adding to the risk of a confrontation between Russia and the US on the already vastly complicated Syrian battlefield. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
And our senior international correspondent, John Irvine, joins me live now from Beirut. John, in Robert's piece, we saw some of the defence geography and some of the assets. What are the military options?
Alistair, I think the most likely military option is multiple missile strikes on multiple Syrian air bases. The result of that would be to salve the conscience of the West and perhaps to spare Idlib province, the last rebel stronghold. Idlib has been used by the Assad regime as a dumping ground for rebels and for people who've surrendered in other parts of Syria. And the big fear is that now he has all his remaining enemies corralled in that one place, Idlib province. He will use his barrel bombs, his jets, and perhaps more chemical weapons against them. American or coalition airstrikes against the Syrian Air Force might prevent that from happening. They might spare Idlib province.
And beyond Idlib, indeed beyond Syria, what are the risks of escalation?
Well, regarding the risks, if missiles are launched by the Americans, ourselves, from ships or subs, there's no risk to the sailors involved. If they're launched from the air, there's not really any risk to pilots. Warplanes don't have to be over Syria to attack Syria. The cruise missile on a Tornado has a range of 200 miles. RAF Akrotiri is 200 miles from Damascus. I think immediately where the risk might lie is to our troops on the ground. The Americans have 2,000. We have several hundred special forces inside Syria. Were there to be American or coalition airstrikes, might the Russians, the Syrian regime, or the Iranians retaliate against our troops? It's one of the consequences that planners will be mulling over tonight.
John, thank you.
Here's what we know so far. President Trump has cancelled a planned foreign trip. He's staying at home to oversee America's response to Syria. Washington has been in discussion with Britain and France, raising the prospect of coordinated Western military action. At the UN tonight, Russia vetoes a bid by the US to investigate the attacks further. Western countries block a Russian counter-proposal. Diplomatic channels are looking strained. Here, Theresa May faces mounting pressure from some of her MPs to support US-led airstrikes against Bashar al-Assad's regime after that latest chemical attack, but it's possible she may hesitate before any action not sanctioned by Parliament. Does what appears to be a blatant disregard for human life by Assad go unpunished? Does UK democracy have to come first? We'll debate all that in a moment. First, Mark Urban.
Journey's end for thousands of Syrian rebels evacuated from Douma. As far as the Assad government is concerned, this is mission accomplished. A key enclave near Damascus has been crushed. But the methods used have energized foreign powers, notably France.
The French drew their own red line last year. Macron was very clear about the fact that France would, even on its own, be ready to contemplate military action if there were demonstrated use of chemical weapons in Syria. So there's no particular surprise there, and Macron knows what happens to presidents who don't abide by their red line.
Politically, Britain's position is more ambiguous. Downing Street's readout of calls with Presidents Trump and Macron today was carefully caveated, referring to reports of chemical weapons use which, if confirmed, would be further evidence of Assad's cruelty.
We are working urgently with our allies and partners to assess what has happened on the ground. If this is the responsibility of Assad's regime in Syria, then it's yet another example of the brutality and brazen disregard for their people that they show.
Adding to caution is the complex mixture of alliances in Syria. Behind Assad's government and its recent victories lie Russia and Iran. And you could add Hezbollah too, not a state but a Lebanese Shiite militia that played a key role in Syria and has thousands of missiles pointed at Israel. Ranged against them are Saudi Arabia and Israel itself, of course. Those two countries would like the US to be taking a stronger line against Iran in Syria, but the White House may not be ready to do that yet, and certainly doesn't want to confront the Russians militarily.
Certainly the Iranians have spent a lot of money. They've committed a fair amount of manpower, although a lot of this are sort of Shia militias and a certain number of Afghans that are moving in either from Iraq, obviously, and Afghanistan. But for them, it's a prestige thing. If they fail in Syria, it will redound very badly on the Revolutionary Guard, who basically dragged the country into this mess.
Sensing a window of diplomatic opportunity, Syria and Russia are casting doubt over the rebel claims. This footage shows troops apparently checking a hospital in Douma for contamination.
In the course of visiting this medical facility, it was established that there were no patients with symptoms of poisoning by toxic compounds of the sarin and chlorine type. None have come to the hospital.
Tonight, in the Security Council, its permanent members clashed over the scope of a fact-finding mission being organised by the chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW. Russia ended up vetoing a US proposal. For their part, Western powers then blocked a rival proposition from Russia for the mission. But even if terms are agreed, a coalition of the willing that could include the US, France and Saudi Arabia still appears ready to strike.
I suspect that this one has a momentum pretty much of its own. The Russians prevented OPCW from pursuing investigative activity in Syria just a few months ago. One suspects, in order to enable the Syrians to be able to conduct this sort of chemical attack without being caught visibly in the act.
As so many times during the long Syrian war, the body designed to prevent global conflict has so far failed to reach a consensus. And when that happens, military options become far more likely.
That was Mark Urban, and he's here right now. What is your sense, Mark, of military readiness? Do you think an attack is imminent?
I don't. It could be done. There's an American warship, the USS Cook, and a French one, the Aquitaine, both equipped with cruise missiles that are within range of Syria. Add in a few B-2 bombers, you could do something in the next 24 hours if you really wanted to. But that would be on the scale of what happened a year ago with the attack on that Syrian airbase after a previous alleged chemical weapons attack. And everything suggests that what they would like to do, the Pentagon and the French, is something bigger. Now, they're not well placed for it. There's no US carrier in the Gulf, and there's no US carrier at the right end of the Mediterranean either. There are 2 US aircraft carriers steaming towards there. The French don't have a carrier at the moment, so it would take a few days, I think, to prepare something that would be bigger and more sustained than what we saw last year.
And it's hard to know at this point what position Britain would take, but in terms of any military contribution, what do you see that being?
Well, you're exactly right. The politics in Britain are clearly different. We can clearly sense the reluctance, but if Theresa May decided to go for it, possibly using royal prerogative, not going to the Commons for a vote, the best option would seem to be Tornado aircraft from Cyprus using a cruise missile called a Storm Shadow. It's conceivable there could also be cruise missiles from a submarine, but although their movements are surrounded by mystery, we don't think there's one in a position to do that at the moment.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Well, I'm joined from New York by Reza Afshar now. He led the Foreign Office's Syria team until 2013. He now works for what's called Independent Diplomat. That's an organisation which advises the Syrian Negotiation Coalition of groups opposed to President Assad. Reza Afshar, thanks for joining us. It's very easy, isn't it, to sort of talk about the superpowers and all this and overlook what Syrians themselves want. What do the opposition groups that you're advising want to happen now?
Well, thanks, Emily. They've been saying the same thing now for several years, which is in order to bring this crisis to a close, Assad's ability to kill civilians indiscriminately needs to be challenged and it needs to be deterred. So what they're looking for is some kind of action that will deter indiscriminate killing against civilians. Now, the action that is being contemplated, I think, by the Americans against chemical weapons is the kind of action, if it was targeted slightly differently, that could deter the killing of civilians. But if it remains narrowly focused only on the chemical weapon threat, then it won't have that bigger impact.
Interesting. So you think that when the West hears or sees chemical weapons, it acts as a trigger that doesn't happen at other times when it should?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely clear that the chemical weapons issue is the key issue for the West at the moment. And you can understand that to a degree, given the kind of architecture that is built around preventing the use of chemical weapons. But at the same time, the Assad regime's use of conventional weapons is the biggest killer in Syria. It is the cause of the continuation of the crisis. And it is also equally illegal because of the manner in which he's using weapons. So what I would say is that it needs, we need to tackle the bigger problem, not just the chemical weapons issue.
Reza, you know as well as I do that some MPs respond to these claims or these calls from opposition groups by saying there's absolutely no cohesion to what the groups on the other side want, that if Assad was removed, there would be further chaos, not resolution to this. What's your response to that?
Well, first, I mean, that's simply not true. I mean, the coalition of opposition groups that negotiates at the peace talks in Geneva is very wide and includes a huge array of opposition groups. Secondly, they know exactly what they want. They want a transition, and that transition preserves parts of the state. It's actually a very sensible plan. And third, in a sense, you can put that aside. You know, it is nonetheless important to uphold international law, and in so doing, you will actually make the process of a negotiation easier, just like in Bosnia, where the Serbs had to be coerced into agreeing a peace deal. It's the same thing in Syria.
What does upholding that mean? What does it actually look like to you now, then?
Well, in terms of action, it would be very similar, actually, to the action that's being contemplated on chemical weapons. The only difference would be that you would say, instead of saying, if you use chemical weapons, we will retaliate, you say, if you kill indiscriminately, we will retaliate. The action would actually be exactly the same.
But when you say action,
is it you would deter.
But is it a strike overnight from Trump, as we saw last year? Is it a commitment to a long-term military offensive from a collection of allies? What is that action you want to see?
Well, you know, what Trump did last year is stage one. You need to take it a step further. You need to say, if you do this again, we will repeat the action that we did last year. So it's a matter of repeating that action every time civilians are killed indiscriminately or every time chemical weapons are used.
But it didn't work last year, did it?
Well, because they didn't repeat it. That's what I'm trying to say, Emily, is that if you only do it once, it doesn't work. You have to show the intent that you're prepared to completely stop their ability to pursue their military strategy or their attempt to use chemical weapons. So what you do is you repeat the action every time they do it. And I would suspect that you do that 6, 7, 8 times, and the distance between the attacks that they do becomes greater and greater because they recognise that they're going to be attacked each time they do it. It's simple. It's very simple deterrence. Briefly,
I can't even ask you to respond to this briefly, but you'll understand my point. How does this war end?
Well, by a negotiation, and if you want to enable that negotiation, you have to limit Assad's military strategy, including his use of chemical weapons.
Thank you very much, Reza Afshar. Thank you. We did ask the government to join us tonight, and the Russian and Syrian governments too. Nobody there was available. But where are the politics on this in Britain tonight? If there is action against Syria of the kind you've heard described, should and could the UK be a part of it? Joining me now is the Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Julian Lewis, and the Labour peer and former Lord Chancellor who served under both Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn, Charlie Faulkner. Very nice to see you both, gentlemen. Julian, let me start with you. A lot of people will think back to what we now think of as a pretty seminal moment of 2013. David Cameron went to Parliament to ask about strikes on Assad. Ed Miliband led a veto, if you like, against that. You were one of those who voted against it. Does that still seem like the right way to have voted, or was it a massive opportunity missed?
No, it was exactly the right thing to do, and that interview that you've just done is hugely revealing, because we're hearing now what is being proposed. What is being proposed is that we should intervene massively on the side of the opposition in Syria against Assad. And the truth is, very different from the suggestion that there are a wide range of opposition groups. Apart from the Kurdish-led fighters, the opposition fighters in Syria are overwhelmingly led by jihadists. And both sides in this civil war are unacceptable to us. And what is now being proposed is the thin end of the wedge so that we would intervene and tip the balance against Assad and in favour of the opposition.
Well, Reza Afshar, as you just heard, vehemently denied that there was that kind of split amongst the opposition groups. You're faced with a leader, a dictator, who, as far as we know, is repeatedly using chemical warfare on his own people. So what do you do?
Sorry, this is a crucial point, and I hasten to add, you've described me as chairman of the Defence Committee, but I'm speaking here for myself. There
Understood.
Will be a range of views on the Defence Committee. But the reality is that if you look at the numbers of airstrikes that we carried out against ISIL-Daesh in Iraq and in Syria, the numbers run for most of the time about 8 in Iraq for every 1 in Syria. Why is that? Because airstrikes can only be effective when they're in support of ground troops. And the only ground troops in Syria that we could support were our Kurdish allies. And what's more, they are currently being attacked by Turkey, a fellow member of NATO that's busy cozying up to Russia. A very good idea for us to get involved in that? I don't think so.
Do you think the PM has your ear on this? Do you think she is with you on this? Or do you think she will go ahead and decide that action is needed?
I have no idea what she will do. I wait to see with interest, but what I'm concerned about is that you do not seem to accept that what we've got here in Syria is a choice between monsters on the one hand and maniacs on the other. And it is absolutely untrue to say that apart from the Kurdish-led forces, the Salafists and the jihadists are not in control of the opposition groups. They are, and we will be helping Al-Qaeda if we help them to do a sustained military campaign against the brutal Assad regime.
Charlie Faulkner.
I mean, there's a desperate desire to do something, but there is no point in, for example, using military force if it is completely ineffective. That would be worse than doing nothing, because ultimately you would be sending a signal that you can't do anything about it. So I think there are 3 things that need to be done. First, you need to have some definitive investigation as to what happened, and although there's been disagreement in the Security Council today...
You heard that Russia's vetoed that tonight.
But the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons is, as I understand it, sending inspectors in any event, so there will be some independent investigation that takes place. I don't know what the form of it will be, I don't know the extent to which it will get access, but it's important that there be some definitive view in relation to that.
So when you hear your old flatmate Tony Blair, for example, say that you don't need a parliamentary vote on this, sometimes you need to take the action at the time you need to take the action, is he wrong?
I think in these circumstances, to go very quickly without an authoritative view as to what happened, a sense that there is a strategy and international agreement about what should happen, and a convincing strike that would do something about it would be a mistake. So I do not think one should go straight away. I do not think it should be done without a parliamentary vote. I think in strict constitutional terms, the executive's got the power to wage war or use military force when the country is at threat, but I don't think that is this case, and that politically there needs to be a parliamentary debate before it happens.
We are 5 years past a moment when we talked about red lines. So what does that say about any impact the West has anymore, or should have? I mean, are both of you telling me tonight that that was the right decision and nothing would have changed in Syria if we had got it?
The key bit of this must be to get Russia to stop supporting Syria in what it is doing, and identifying and tailoring things that will make Russia stop what it is doing is the key thing, and that requires...
You can't do that without taking Russia off the Security Council.
Well, but you can get a group of countries, a widespread group of countries that will make Russia pay a price, not necessarily militarily, for what they are doing.
2013 was exactly the right thing to do. If we had done what is now being suggested, and what was being suggested then, which was to bring down Assad, it would have had exactly the same effect as bringing down other dictators.
We
would have had a jihadist...
Should we be working harder to prop Assad up so that the war is over one way or another?
I would not like to involve ourselves in supporting either of these equally reprehensible sides in this civil war, because whereas in Iraq we now have a situation where we feel we can support the government forces, in Syria we have recommended bombing first one side and then the other, and now the first side again. And the answer is we touch this at our peril. There is nothing going on that Assad is doing that Saddam Hussein didn't do 10 times over. 30 years ago, he killed not 50 people with gas, he killed 5,000 people.
You're opening a whole can of worms then, because obviously you voted for Iraq and we went into Iraq.
But the point I did, and I made a mistake. And the point about this is, if you want to say we should bring down Assad now, then you've got to justify what we did in Iraq, and you've got to be prepared to spend 15 years, as we did, turning Syria around.
Is that still justifiable now?
Oh, well, there'd be no appetite anywhere here for going for 15 years into Syria. But we need to start building coalitions to make a real difference in relation to this, because I think the message of 2013 is that nothing happened after Parliament voted not to use force, which I think was the right decision at that stage, but then everybody went away.
Thank you both very much. Thanks for coming in.
Well, Ian and Dia are here to discuss more. To the Telegraph we go first. The United Nations has failed to make any headway in what to do about this alleged chemical attack in Syria. So it looks like it's down to this man, does it, Mr. Trump?
That doesn't bode particularly well, does it? So, yeah, look, I mean, nothing can be done at the Security Council because Russia's on the Security Council and they will veto anything that moves. So it's never going to be a goer. Everybody knew it wasn't going to be a goer. And if this stuff is going to work in any way, it has to somehow sidestep that process. The manner in which it looks like it's going to take place is France, the UK and the US. There are some difficulties here. I mean, in terms of British politics, the difficulty is the timelines for the kind of military action you would take do not correspond to the fact that you may want consent from the House of Commons. Now, MPs are currently away on recess. They'll be coming back soon. There's no legal requirement that this takes place, but there is a precedent, there is a convention that it should take place. And that makes it a little bit more difficult. But of course, Washington will be lobbying quite hard that there is no sort of vote from the House of Commons on this matter. And to be honest, just in terms of the timescale, it seems quite hard to see where it would fit in.
What has the House of Commons previously agreed? Obviously, we look back at the famous vote in 2013 with Ed Miliband. But subsequent to that, UK air forces have been involved over Iraq, haven't they?
They have. We were discussing this earlier, actually, of which way it would go. You're right, in 2013, it stopped it, and by stopping it, I think it effectively stopped Obama from intervening as well.
Yes.
I'm not sure that would be the case this time. I sort of feel because this is a much more clear-cut operation with a limited intention, which is to cripple the chemical sort of capacity of Assad, rather than the much more open-ended idea which was being pursued in 2013, where people weren't really very clear on exactly what it was they were trying to achieve in 2013. It was kind of an instinctive, we've got to do something, and that made people quite nervous. So I suspect that it could be won in the Commons this time, although it would cause severe eruptions and I think would tear Labour right down the middle.
I slightly disagree with Ian here. Actually, I think it would be really difficult for Mrs May to get consensus in Parliament. The Whitehall source here, quoted in our paper today, is saying that Theresa May would have preferred to go to Parliament to have that backing before she goes ahead with any sort of military operation. But it seems like, given the rush, if you like, if that's an appropriate word to use in this scenario, that President Trump and President Macron seem to be on, it seems like she might not have that choice. And it also seems like there's no plans to get MPs back who Parliament's in recess at the moment. So there's no plans for any of that for that to happen. What's interesting in this story is how the language is differing between Downing Street and what the White House is saying. So it seems very much like the White House's tone is, let's go and do this. Downing Street tonight has been a lot more constrained, I think, and is saying, to quote, it says, the number 10 statement says today that the chemical attack, if confirmed, and that's a quote, would represent fresh evidence of Assad's appalling cruelty. So it'll be interesting to see which side sort of wins over on this. And this is a very serious matter, and due consideration must be given before anything is done. But I think it's also coming to a situation where people just cannot stand back and watch children and women and men being chemically attacked.
And it does seem that chemical weapons inspectors will be allowed in. The suggestion is that you can't have airstrikes while they're there. Mr. Trump has delayed or postponed a visit to South America at the weekend. So we're looking days ahead. There is plenty of time to recall Parliament if she chose to do so.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, but I think there is a sense that things are moving very, very quickly. As you say, I think what President Trump either did not go to South America or came back early.
Well, he was, yes, he's decided not to go.
Not to go. So I think things are moving quite quickly. And, you know, May came quite late into this, remember. It was quite astonishing, actually, in a way, that President Trump called President Macron first.
Yes,
and
twice.
they had that conversation even before, right, even before they had that conversation, even before May got involved. So that may be something that is a result of what happened in 2013 when President Obama failed to get that support from the Brits. And then decided, you know, not to go ahead with that attack. Maybe it's to do with that, I don't know, but I think people have taken notice of the fact that Macron got the first call and not May.
It's funny, they seem to get on, actually, Trump and Macron, even though, of course, they're much more politically distant than May is from Trump, and people associate Brexit with Trump quite heavily. But actually, Macron and Trump have managed to strike up a quite pragmatic working relationship, despite the fact that politically they're very, very distant. The other thing that we don't talk about here, of course, is the fact that it's not just military options that should be on the table. There's actually quite a multidisciplinary approach that you can take towards eliminating the...
Despite the plane sat there on the front of the eye.
Yes, exactly. But of course, that's sort of the most sort of compelling vision of how we do things, and that's instinctively the way that Britain and America often think about these things. You can also block the ingredients that go into the composition of things. Harder with chlorine, which seems to have been used quite regularly, but easier with stuff like sarin gas, where there are ingredients that you can block from going into Syria itself. You can also try and block certain kind of laboratory equipment in the development of new chemical munitions. You could also start thinking about what you might do to take people to trial eventually for war crimes.
But that's a nice idea. But surely Russia can access all of this material and take it into Syria to help his mate Assad. And
there are absolutely limitations on everything that we can do, and there's absolutely no magic bullet in anything. It's just to say that apart from and in addition to a military response, there are other things you can be doing at the same time, and those things could be pursued.
OK, we'll see what happens, certainly. Everybody holding their breath and waiting to see what Britain, the US and France decide to do. To the Times we go first, contrasting the Telegraph and the Eye, as we heard there, that Theresa May is resisting calls to join US action against Syria.
So Times actually saying that Theresa May has said that she would need more evidence to get involved in this before she goes ahead with a military strike against Syria. The Times article goes a little bit further than that as well. It points out that while on Monday President Trump had said that they were going to go ahead with, or they were going to decide the US's action in 48 hours, as that deadline looms, it doesn't seem like an imminent strike is on the cards. So this is actually quite a different way that they've reported this story, or a different angle that they've taken to the Telegraph story. It's quite interesting to see. It goes into a little bit more detail into what happened at the UN Security Council tonight, where it seemed that Russia vetoed an independent investigation into exactly what happened in Syria, and only Bolivia supported Russia and China abstained. So if you think of the UN Security Council as a forum where you're trying to find solutions, where just through diplomacy, just through talking, it seems like that wasn't particularly successful. So now it's up to the rest of the world to work out what they're going to do about this, given that a lot of them has actually drawn out red lines, the use of chemical weaponry, and now they have to decide whether they're going to act.
And Russia's own resolution, to be fair, was also thrown out, wasn't it, by most nations. I think 6 of the 15 Security Council members voted against it. So it was a tit for tat. It was never going to work at the United Nations. So what happens now, then?
Well, that's the question. So there is obviously a sense of urgency, although, again, you're right to point out that the Times is taking quite a different slant on this. It's even suggesting that Trump himself is quite hesitant. He obviously said 24 to 48 hours. It now looks like that time frame won't probably be reached. It may look like we're not quite getting there. However, there is a sense of urgency with Macron and Trump and May, as hesitant as she is. Even Macron, it seems to be limiting to what he's saying he's prepared to do to striking against the chemical infrastructure, chemical weapons infrastructure. That would presumably be production and development, supply lines going into those areas, storage facilities. However, with something like chlorine, of course, this is stuff that can be used in a variety of ways. And it's very hard to hit a storage facility for something like chlorine while guaranteeing a minimum sort of collateral damage and that you're not hitting someone who is uninvolved with chemical attacks. So very, very difficult stuff. You get a sense of an awareness of the difficulties. Remember, once upon a time, last time this happened, America just went it alone without talking to anyone. This time it is clearly following a sort of more multilateral approach, even if that doesn't extend to the UN, where nothing can be done, and simply towards France and Britain. So there is a sense of urgency, but there's also quite clearly restrictions on people, not least of all, of course, from a British perspective, the fact that the House of Commons should technically be asked to sort of vote for this, even though I think that's probably quite unlikely.
Yes, so just before we come to that, the irony is not lost on anybody that, you know, many in the world supported Theresa May's actions on Salisbury, throwing out Russian diplomats. Is she duty-bound to help now in this action against Syria and, you know, its supporter, Russia? And asking for more evidence and more information is exactly what Jeremy Corbyn did over the Skripal. So what is the difference here? And the UK ambassador to the UN yesterday was asked that, and she said quite categorically, the difference is that in Salisbury there is a proper investigation, and in Syria there is not, and that's a clear dividing line.
Yes, I mean, there are inspectors that are going in to clarify this, but it has to be said, it's very, very difficult. One of the things that happens is that journalists found it impossible to operate in Syria, and the Syrian regime made it impossible, and also sort of very many of the sort of borderline fascistic sort of Islamic groups that were operating against the government made it such an impossible situation that even when you try to find photographs of what goes on, you don't find any really from professional journalists.
Well, and photos are emerging tonight of Russian military vehicles in Ghouta who are leading the effort to remove militants, those opposed to Assad, from the area. They can close down the investigation in some respects, although chemical weapons inspectors are going in, aren't they?
But to your point, whether Theresa May is actually duty-bound to do something, I think that all of the world leaders involved should set themselves a threshold whereby they all need to be convinced that this is the right thing to do. So if it convinces one of them, I'd have thought that it would be a high enough threshold for them all, or they'd get together and consider it properly. So I don't see it as a, well, my mates are saying this is the right thing to do, so I need to get in.
But Barack Obama had the red line of chemical weapons attacks. 2013, we go back, Ed Miliband was thrown out of the House of Commons.
He did. I mean, look, the Syrian regime has killed a lot of people using chemical attacks, and that is documented. That is a fact. That is not something that we're uncertain about. It's been documented over and over again, not least by the UN itself. We are now seeing another situation where this has been well documented what took place. We may not be able to pin the blame specifically on the Syrian regime, but we know that they have done this already on at least 2 occasions with sarin gas and on several occasions with chlorine. So, I mean, you know, there's a certain extent to say, OK, yes, we do not have definitive proof, but you really have to be quite imaginative to come up with some other story for what has taken place here.
But I think in the background there'll also be this consideration whether by getting involved we're going to make matters worse for everybody involved. So I think that will also be that will also be in the background, and you've got to think about that as well.
Well, the eye, sorry to interrupt you, dear. The eye saying Theresa May pledging to work closely with Trump and Macron, perhaps an interesting use of language there. And the Telegraph, your paper, is also leading on this. Big picture there of Donald Trump. May stands behind Trump on strikes against Syrian regime. Presumably they have to wait for these weapons inspectors to have a look. And also he has said he won't go to South America at the weekend, so bought himself maybe a few more days.
Probably. But for me, the interesting point in our paper that we're running today is this Whitehall source saying that May would have liked her parliament to be behind her before she comes to a decision. And that's quite interesting. And I think that's the right thing to do as well. You know, she would have liked to have the backing of her own parliament before she goes into something so serious. Whether that's actually going to happen, given that parliament's in recess. And actually, you and I disagree on this, don't we, Ian? Because you think that May would probably be able to get this through parliament quite easily, whereas I don't think she would. I think the disunity in both the parties would mean that, you know, everybody would take this opportunity to stick it to the government. But I think Ian's got a different...
It's uncertain. I suspect that she probably would win the vote. I mean, I wouldn't bet my own money on it, I have to say. But I suspect that she would win the vote. I also think you'd be looking probably at about 1/3 to 2/3 of Labour would join her. And what I'm not sure about is whether the Labour leadership would want to join her.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the real sort of divide. I think Labour will be more divided than the Conservatives are.